Okay, so this one is kind of off the wall, but it's just something I wanted to put out there in the ether just to see if it will stick and someone will find it one day and say, well, isn't this astounding that someone found this information? So I just watched part of a video about quote unquote reality isn't real. It's this stupid idea that's been floating around the internet for a while. At least a decade. It's not new by any means. It's been around for a long time. This idea that we're all living in a simulation is kind of okay. I don't have that much of a problem with it because it's possible. I can take that with a little bit of credence, but then people sometimes couple that with the idea that things aren't real until you look at them, or the act of observation somehow magically causes for example, light beam to resolve into either a particle or a wave form. And it's the stupidest idea I've ever seen. It's the idea that somehow by literally just looking at something, not touching it, but just looking at it, that it knows that it's being watched, gets embarrassed, and then commits to a particular position. It's so stupid. Obviously, what's going on is not that. So then what is it? Well, I think what's happening is it's being touched, not observed passively through the eyes. When a layman hears the term observed, they're thinking of natural observation with just their eyesight. When a scientist uses the term observed, they mean something a little bit more vague, in the same way that a scientist might refer to a radio wave as light. And it's because the way that those terms are being defined are two completely different definitions. The layperson's definition of observation, natural observation, is passive. And if you were to apply that definition of observation to the findings that Albert Einstein discovered through the double slit experiment, then yeah, then it'll seem magical. But as soon as you realize the definition of observation in those terms is not natural observation, it's assisted through scientific instruments. And then it suddenly becomes understandable. Oh, well, it's because of the instrument that you're using. What kind of an instrument is it? Well, for example, if they're going to observe whether or not there's an interference pattern on the other side of the slits, they give the photon a choice to go through one of two slits, right? So the slits physically touch the photon to then create these interference patterns. So that's part of it. It's getting touched by that. Now, a lot of people think that that's not really happening, but then again, if it's a wave, or if it exhibits any wave properties, then of course the wave is going to touch the slit and interact with it and interfere with it, or be interfered with by it. It'll create an effect because of the physical locality and it touching it. So when somebody says, well, because it was observed, it magically became committed to this position of being a wave because, it got really embarrassed that we asked it what its name was, and it was all shy, and it was like looking down at its little toes and its little sandal shoes, and it was like, oh, I don't know. So then we had to like coax it and, show it that it is cared about and loved. And then it was comfortable enough to share with us that sometimes it likes to act like a wave. And the way that they couch these terms, it almost seems deliberate. It almost seems like there's this mass conspiracy of trying to teach people that don't know nothing about science, that somehow science is telling scientists that reality isn't real and that we're all part of a simulation and that there is action at a distance. There is not. There cannot be, ever, action at a distance. It does not happen. That's why they found ether or 0 point energy in space. And they found that space is not a vacuum, because if it were, there would be no medium through which light travels. There would be no way for light to travel from the sun to the earth if the space in between the sun and the earth was a true vacuum, because there'd be nothing propagating the light. It would simply cease existing. It would dissipate into nothingness along with the vacuum, which would then eat it and rip it apart. And there would not be light that ever hit the earth. Either that, or there would be so much dissipation from that light that you would get a luminiferous ether that propagated through that vacuum. So no matter how you look at it, there has not, and nor ever will be, action at a distance. It is not possible, it is not logical, it is not proven, it has never been seen. It doesn't matter what you cite as your study, you are wrong, and you didn't read the study, or you didn't understand the difference in definitions. Those are the only two explanations for saying something as silly as, when you observe a light beam, it forces it to resolve. And then say, therefore, reality isn't real and everything in it is some illusion. It's not an illusion. I don't know who told all these people that reality isn't real. It's a self-contradictory paradox to say reality isn't real. It's silly. And the idea needs to die. It was stillborn, it never was alive, it has no soul, it has no purpose, it has no way to integrate into reality, because it simply doesn't make any sense. And basically what it is it's a sad, desperate attempt, in my opinion, from Charles, the Illuminati, to warp our minds back to a pre-civilization state where we no longer function, where we can no longer trust literally anything, and we go back to shouting into the winds because we didn't appease the storm god that day. We didn't offer the proper sacrifices. It would keep us malleable, compliant, and stupid to believe these stupid lies. What is actually happening is that every time you interact with something, it causes a change. That's as simple as it gets, folks. It's that simple. When you put light through two slits, the slits interact with the light, and that's where you get the interference pattern from. And then you can say, okay, so then why does the interference pattern disappear when you observe the photon? Because they slowed this down to make it really precise. Instead of just firing a massive group of light photons through both the slits at the same time, they said, okay, wait, let's just slow it down and only put one photon at a time through it. And when they did that without tracking it, without observing it, just firing the photons through the slits, then the interference pattern disappears. And so then the photon is acting like a particle. And then if you put if there's nothing observing the particle as it's going through the slit, then the interference pattern is there and it is behaving like a wave. If, however, you put some instrument that's observing or tracking whether or not the particle is traveling through one slit or another, then the interference pattern goes away. Now, the reason that some people might find that spooky is because, again, they're thinking of natural observation. They're thinking of passive observation, and that is like thinking that space is a vacuum or the earth is flat. You know, intuitively it might strike you like that, but when you really think about it, it isn't that way, and it can't be. If the earth really was flat, it would have an edge. If there really was passive observation, then how did the light reach my eyes, and how did I ever see it? It had to cross some kind of a medium, and it had to physically touch my eye. That sight that I experience is not passive at all. It's the result of an interaction from light interacting with my iris, and then that iris interacting with the nerve cells in my optical nerve area, and that goes into my ocular processing part of my brain, and then it gets perceived as light, the experience of something that's illumined. So there is no such thing as action at a distance. There is no such thing as a particle or wave getting embarrassed and deciding to commit to a position because it got shy and somebody made it feel bad, so it chose one of the positions over the other. It's happening because when a scientific instrument observes something, if it's going to observe the light, it will touch it. It will send some signal to it and then read the difference as it comes back. If it's a camera, the light is hitting the camera and bouncing off of the camera, and it's interacting that way. But there's always an interaction. Now, if we're talking about a single photon, that tiny little interaction starts to make a big difference. And then it's going to collapse the wave function, and then the light particle will resolve back into a tighter wave probability. Because if you think about it, the distinction between a particle and a wave is the distinction between something that is quote unquote discrete or definite or certain or 100% versus something that is less than 100%. But even that discrete object has a probability, I guess you'd call it a surface area, wrapping around it at the edge. And the reason for that is because the particle is composed of smaller fluctuations, just like everything is. No matter how far you zoom in, it never reaches an absolute value. Now, you could throw your hands up in the air and say, oh, that's not true because physics said that there's discrete packets of energy, and that's true for such phenomena. It's not true for every single thing that's composing of that phenomenon. You have to remember that every single thing that you hold in your hand is made up of smaller things than it. There is no such thing as a discrete packet of energy that is quantized and then nothing beneath it, because then it would have to be composed of nothing. Or you would have to say that it magically entered into existence without knowing how or why it would. I counter that there is no magic, that there's just smaller stuff than we can see. So that by the time you get to 0-point energy, you're looking at something so small that it no longer fits inside of any particular definite shape. It's just a flowing fluid of ether. It's just a 0-point energy field or fluctuating energy, wave or fluid. It's not going to have a discrete quantizable form at that level. However, if you were to measure something that is quantifiable, then of course you would find that it is quantifiable because you asserted that that's a part of the measure that you need to have. It's sort of like asking all men to show up to a particular room and then be surprised to find only men in it. And it's like, well, that's what you asked for, that's what you requested, that's what you ordered. So why would you be surprised that that is also the result? So if somebody says that there is a definite, distinct, discrete, definite packet of energy, particle, whatever you want to call it, what is that made up of? And then if you say, well, that's as small as it gets, then I'm going to say that's as small as it gets for what? Because there are no such things as absolute non-contingencies. Everything is contingent upon something else. There is nothing there that you could ever point to that isn't contingent upon something else other than itself. Everything is contingent upon something else because everything is causally dynamically interrelated with everything else because locality is real. And it's also fractal. So you can talk about large spaces, like for example, my house, and I can say my house is a definite object. It has such and such rooms in it, a bathroom, maybe a rug on the floor. It has certain siding that I can see and measure, and I can even look at the texture of it, etc. I can tell you about the color of the paint. I can tell you about the age of the house, etc. I could give you a whole bunch of attributes that seemingly never change, right? But when I say the house is 70 years old, that presumes that it was built, over the course of a split instant. And that doesn't make sense because the house didn't just spontaneously appear. It had to be built. And it may have taken years to build it. So then does it begin when the first brick was laid? Is it considered to be built the moment that the last brick was made and put down into the wall or the structure or whatever? Is it when the last drop of paint was added to the outside of the house? Does it count then if the neighbor graffitis the side of it the next 30 seconds after that, and then they have to come back and redo it? Is the redo part of it? Is the graffiti? No, because there's too much time that elapsed. But you see how arbitrary that is to say. And then you could say, well, it was done on that day. Well, was it done at midnight? Or was it done at noon? Or was it done at 2 p.m.? Or was it done at 2:07? Was it done at 2:07 and 36 seconds? Was it done at 2:07 and 36 seconds and 100,000 picoseconds? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The sharper that you attempt to make that line, the blurrier everything gets. And that's all of these experiments have ever proven or will ever prove, is the sharper that your resolution, the blurrier the image will get, because you're not focusing on the image, you're focusing on all the information, because the image is always being contrasted with its backdrop, with the things that are outside of it that are not it. And there's no such thing that exists that it has nothing outside of it. There's always something else outside of it. And then if you were to think about, well, what is then the universe? Because then there would have to be nothing outside the universe, because the universe is singular and we only have one of them and everything's in it. And then I would say, well, then there might be a multiverse, or you could talk about potential universes that haven't yet actualized. Alternate timelines, for example, like in Fallout, where there is an alternate timeline where, everybody's still stuck in a world war, but it's like 30 years after the initial start, but it never got resolved. And so everybody's like, hiding out in bunkers because of nuclear fallout. So you can always consider an outside. And this is also the difference between classical physics and quantum physics. In classical physics, you disregard the environment and you treat the object as discrete, which is to say it's isolated. It has a definite boundary, and there isn't anything outside of it that causally influences it. It's just its own little world. And the crazy magic of classical physics is this weird assumption that there are these isolated objects that aren't connected with anything else. Because consider, for example, whatever device it is that you're using to listen this to. It's sitting on something. Or if it's floating in the air, it's sitting in something, like a spaceship. But it's somewhere to be found. And wherever that is bigger than it, because I know where it is. Now, if my resolution shrinks to something smaller than the device is that you're using to listen to this to, then you won't be able to hear what I'm saying anymore, because we're going to be talking about components of the device that you're using. And because you're focusing on the components or parts of the device that you're using rather than the device as a whole, it ceases to be discrete. So there are no such things as discrete objects. Discrete objects don't exist. Discrete objects are abstract mathematical objects that people invent for, clean math. Well, have you ever noticed how clean math never really quite works? Like, we can track a meteor, for example, or we can track a comet, or we can even land satellites by predicting the trajectory of comets as they pass near Earth. But what we can't do is get a computer to automate that process. It has to be experimented with slightly in real time so that you can make adjustments. Because the math is always a little bit off, no matter what you apply it to. And the larger it is, the greater the error. And you'll see the error rate approach infinity. The error rate will approach a larger ratio than the signal is, and that's called signal to noise ratio. If the signal to noise ratio gets imbalanced, you'll get too much noise in the signal, too much static on the radio, for example, and you won't be able to tell what the actual signal is or what it's saying. So that is the only thing that they have or will ever discover that is quote unquote spooky. And the only reason that it's spooky is because people forget that their eyes are not themselves, that they exist as, separate entities, and they are interacting with the light beams. It's not passive. There are no passive observations. Every observation is an interaction. Everything in the universe is causally interactive. It all interacts. There is no way for somebody to claim that locality is not real. That does not make sense. The structure of your sentence, when you state it, proves that that can't be true. If locality were not real, you would not be able to form local structures into sentences, sentences into paragraphs, paragraphs into the entire length of whatever it is that you're arguing. The act of argument requires locality. The act of discernment requires locality. The act of observation requires locality. There has to be a location of the observer, which necessarily cannot be the same location as the thing that's observed. And so again, it's not spooky action at a distance, and it's not that somehow the particle decides to stop interfering with itself. It's that the very act of observation is not passive. That's the thing that I wish they would stress, is that every time that you are observing anything, even natural observation, requires an interaction. And every interaction requires a ratio of influence. There is no such thing as an immovable object or an unstoppable force or an absolute rest. Everything is in constant flux. Everything is a ratio. Everything is a probability. Now, when we say something reaches 100% probability or certainty, the act of it reaching 100% certainty is actualization. It's a convergence of possibilities, usually into an aggregate. And that's not really that surprising. It's just the averaging of all possibilities into something that has a final product that isn't weighted by anything other than a difference in ratio of causality, which is a difference in ratio of mass or energy. So once you have calculated for all of that, there really wouldn't be very much variance except for the variance that's caused by the initial assumptions that defined all of the things to begin with, which are necessarily unprovable, and there's a multiplicity of alternatives, all of which are contradictory to it, and all of which reach different conclusions, which means that the resolution of our eventual conclusions will always get better the more independent ways that we arrive at those conclusions. So if I want to conclude that an apple is red, then I will gain in certainty or confidence the more number of people that I ask that all agree with me that yes, the apple is red. And it will approach 100% certainty as I ask all the people, and they all say, yes, indeed, that is an apple that is red. Then we establish what an apple is and what red is, and imply the act of observation or perception. But the apple doesn't suddenly become red, and it doesn't suddenly become an apple because I asked so many people. It's just that I can become more confident in my rendering of the information about the apple and its redness. So I am not confident in it being an apple or it being red. I'm confident that other people will agree that it is an apple and it is red because we're all using the same definitions. And all that means is that as subjects, we don't have direct access to objects because we exist in a subjective field of subjectivity, and objects exist in an objective field of objectivity. And you can't ever occupy the same location as the object, so there's always a distance between you and the object. And the act of observation is always an interaction, which means that there's some give and take between me, the observer, and the object, the observed. And so there's always going to be some causality that is transferred between me and the observed object, even if it's just quote unquote passively sitting there. It's not actually passive or sitting there, because if it were passive in an absolute sense, it wouldn't exist, because it wouldn't present itself. It would not interact with the light. Like, you know how when somebody doesn't speak, they're silent, so there's no perturbations in the air. There's no sound waves if they don't speak. So if they were to somehow silence the light that's around them so that they're not speaking that, then they would be invisible and they would be silent, etc. And as you go through all of the things that occur during interactions of observation, then you realize that there's several dimensions, probably an infinite number of dimensions of interactions that are going on during every observation that you have. And the more of those that you take into account, the richer the final outcome will be, and the more confident in that image that you can be. It doesn't change anything about what it is, but it does change the correspondence or equality or indiscernibility between the object and my perception of that object. And that's how I become more factually accurate. And that's all that means.